have not, I definitely encourage you to take a look at the exhibition that I'm going to talk about today as a model for thinking about the use of Photovoice as a research method. And I'm going to extend kind of the same list of thank yous. I'm so grateful for the opportunity to come here and share my research with all of you. This wouldn't have been possible without the support of the Institute for Policy and Governance, the Center for European Union Transatlantic and Trans-European Space Studies, the Center for Refugee, Migrant, and Displacement Studies. So thanks to all of the folks who were involved in bringing me here for this presentation. So for those of you who came to my talk last night, you will see some redundancies as I talk about my project, but I'm going to focus more on research design today. So hopefully you'll get a better picture of my work as a way of understanding how you might implement this method in your own projects. So this workshop has been organized to walk you linearly through the research process from design to implementation to dissemination of findings. There are three primary learning objectives that we're hoping to achieve today. So the first is to define and explain the applications of Photovoice as a research method. Second, to review some of the procedures, challenges, and ethical considerations of using Photovoice. And because it's always better to show than tell, these first two goals will be accomplished by demonstrating how I use Photovoice in my recent study on the emotional impact of infrastructure conditions on internally displaced persons in the Republic of Georgia. At times, you may be invited to participate in some short discussion and reflection activities related to Photovoice, so I hope to have your engaged participation for those things. And as you'll see throughout the presentation, there are different photos that come from this Photovoice exhibition. On these slides, you'll see that there are photo credits, pseudonyms, and titles of photos were all chosen by the participants. There's also a number of photos in here thrown in that I took during the research to show you different aspects of my Photovoice process. So to help you understand Photovoice and how it can be used as a rigorous, systematic, and empirically rich research method, I'm going to first talk about research design in a kind of broad and general sense, and then I'll get a little bit more specific. So the first step to any project design is to consider the philosophical and theoretical perspectives that shape our background assumptions about what constitutes knowledge. The methodological decisions you make should be driven by your ontological beliefs and based on your initial epistemological philosophy. You should strive for internal consistency between these things. I'm stressing this because it's tempting to look at a method like Photovoice and think, wow, photos are fun. And to think about it in a trivial sense. But I would argue that using this method should connect with your epistemology and your larger methodological approach. So this includes choosing methods capable of answering the research questions you develop. These questions should respond to a gap in knowledge, which came out of an extensive review of an existing literature on your research problem. Methods of data collection tend to be divided, as probably most of you know, between quantitative, qualitative, or mixed methods approach. Today, we're going to emphasize visual research methods, which tend to be qualitative and are used to understand things like social experiences and systems of meaning. So this goes back to your own projects. What is it that you're trying to measure? And can a method like this effectively accomplish that? So to begin thinking about visual methods, I thought we could start with just a short kind of collaborative brainstorming activity. So what I'd like you to do is basically think, pair, share. Turn to a partner, and using this is more of just an artifact for you to remember today. But I'd like you to discuss your responses to the following questions with your partner. And I'll give you somewhere between 3 and 5 minutes, depending on what the discussion looks like. So first, generally speaking, why is a picture worth 1,000 words? We often use this adage, but what does that mean to you? Why is visual data so important? Next, what is visual data? And what can visual data accomplish that other types in research cannot? So I'll let you self-organize, turn to one or two folks by you, and take a stab at responding to these questions. So do I have any volunteers to kind of take a stab at this first question? Why is a picture worth 1,000 words? What do we mean when we say that? You can just shout stuff out too. You don't have to be orderly.
I mean, we talked about how, like, when you are describing something through words, you have the picture of it in your mind or wherever it is. And a picture is you're bringing the thing that you're writing about to the people, like your reader. Does that make sense? It's like we had really smart things. It's like, yeah, I don't know. Like, so
you need to put that down. Really smart.
Really smart.
Like if you were describing this garden here in words and like a poem or a story or an article, you have done the work of interpreting and describing and looking at it, but the picture itself is what produced those words for you, and it produces the words for other people who come and look at it.
So it provides a way of communicating about things that we're observing in a richer way, maybe, or it's capturing details that might otherwise be left out.
In a more faithful way.
Okay. More faithful to reality. Okay, that's interesting phrase.
I think we are designed to make meaning of our sensory information. We may not be able to express that meaning without 1,000 words or carefully designed poem, but individually, we make meaning out of what we see. Otherwise, it's just there.
Is this, can I put this word down for what you're saying? Multisensory?
Well, yes, but I think there's also a process of making of meaning in the human experience out of aesthetic information.
Okay.
Multi-sensory.
We talked about exactly the same point, I think, as we accord it meaning or meanings. You know, in and of itself, it may not have a meaning. We accord it meaning.
Okay.
You know, a waterfall might be beautiful, but it also could produce electricity and you might fall over it. All of those things go into seeing the waterfall.
Into seeing. Okay.
So in that way, it is more authentic, maybe, a picture. And everybody, as an audience of that, could engage with that in its authenticity and interpret in its own way, rather than putting simply like in certain words that is interpretation of a certain person. Okay.
So much.
Good.
It's a term I really like. It was saturated. It was information saturation.
Oh yeah.
Great. What about this other set of questions? So what do we consider visual data? So we're talking about photos primarily today, but there are other types of visual data, correct? And if so, what are they? Drawings. Drawings, yes. Maps. I'm a geographer, so I'm partial to this one.
Graphs.
Graphs. Video. Video. It's not just the objects themselves, but it can also be a process that we engage someone to do, right? So we can ask them. So one technique as a geographer, mental mapping, right? Asking people to draw the spaces and how they interact with them. It tells you about how they come to imagine and know those spaces as a representation of their memory and their experience, for example. What does this type of data accomplish that other maybe traditional methods, so interviewing or surveys, like what does this accomplish that maybe those are limited in?
It makes less linear communication available. Speech in whatever form tends to be linear. Even I read like cyberpunk novels and things, and they have to jump around stories a lot, but that makes it hard. Whereas you can see whether it's a 9 map or whether it's an image, there's lots of different pieces of context and resolution there that the beholder is able to process in their own time and way.
Yeah. So it's a different way of presenting information that can, like you said, it better reflects the messiness of the lived reality. Other things?
You can also record something that you weren't initially paying attention to.
Yeah. There's a lot of information embedded in an image that maybe if you just have the text of someone's speech, you would miss that detail otherwise, right? It can be discovered later through careful observation.
It's also a specificity of reference. This is what it is. It's so complex, but it is also, this is it.
Yeah, and it can be very powerful for capturing a moment in time that might be otherwise fleeting too. So it's a great tool for capturing change in that way, especially if you have a series, you collect a series of images over time. Okay, that's a great starting point. So we'll go into this a little bit in more depth. So visual research methods are a collection of methods that use images as part of the process of generating data. These methods can be participatory or non-participatory. Examples of visual methods include things like visual ethnographies, photo elicitation, participatory mapping, for instance, or any kind of participatory drawing. Visual methods use a wide range of images. It can be maps, drawings, photos, film, video, graffiti, advertising, kind of limitless. Today, we'll focus on the creation and interpretation of participated generated data, particularly photos. So the phrase "a picture is worth 1,000 words" reminds us that visual research methods have many advantages. For example, it can be effective in recognizing participants as experts in their own lives. It can bolster collaboration, and it can improve trust between researcher and research subject. In turn, this can offer explicit ideas and experiences that might otherwise be difficult to express, or it can help researcher and research subject overcome communication barriers. It can also be useful for bringing visibility to things like social issues and groups that would otherwise remain invisible. However, there are many limitations and challenges to visual methods. For example, visual methods may require more planning, resources. It may require access or knowledge and use of special equipment like cameras. This can create barriers to participation if training and access is not taken into the consideration in the study procedures. It can require courage on the part of the participant themselves to share maybe inner thoughts that they might not otherwise be comfortable doing. Participants who are already hesitant about things like traditional interviews may avoid consenting to this type of participatory project, but the reverse is that if some people might be more prone to participate in something like this, as opposed to a traditional interview, especially as we continue through this age of Instagram, right? So this might be appealing to someone who is used to always having a camera in their hand and sharing information this way. Because this requires a lot of time commitment from a participant, retention may also be an issue in these types of studies. Designing ethical research procedures for IRB approval tend to be more cumbersome for this type of project because there are extra permissions related to the use of images and protecting things like confidentiality. And depending on the sensitivity of the project topic, this can put constraints on the handling and dissemination of stories. And finally, findings from this type of research may be difficult to generalize, which is not uncommon to other types of qualitative research. So today I'm going to talk about Photovoice, and Photovoice is a specific type of research method. It's defined as a community-based photographic participatory method seeking to build critical consciousness by amplifying the voices of those in positions of limited power to tell their stories of marginality, injustice, and exploitation. Although it's certainly not limited to that, but a lot of the literature tends to focus on this. Photovoice was first developed by Carolyn Wong and Mary Ann Burris in 1997 and is influenced by feminist theory, the idea of empowerment, and critical consciousness. These goals are achieved by engaging participants in the research process through photography. This typically combines what we call autophotography, an approach that asks participants to take photos of their environment, and photo elicitation, which uses photos to generate verbal discussion and evoke deep emotion, memory, and ideas. So you could do those two things separately as separate methods, but combining them together is kind of what Photovoice is. Images are used to deconstruct problems by posing meaningful questions in a community to find actionable solutions. And that tends to be the participatory element. Photovoice is commonly used in the fields of anthropology and sociology, community development, public health, and education, although we see it elsewhere. There's no single method of implementation. So if you are considering using this method, my recommendation is do a thorough literature review of how this method has been used, how it's been used specifically on the type of population you're studying and the context to learn more about specific context-related challenges that you might encounter. So for instance, I work on migration. So when I was looking at Photovoice, I was looking at examples where this method was used with migrant or refugee populations. The main goal of Photovoice is generally to help people whose needs and sometimes their very existence are often ignored, gain some sense of control over their lives. Therefore, Photovoice might be considered under some of the following circumstances. When Photovoice can change people's opinions about themselves, so it provides an opportunity for self-discovery and a community to better understand their own problems. It can be useful when a problem or situation needs to be publicized, when we need to bring attention to something. Moreover, it can be useful when change is necessary and policymakers or others need to be held accountable. So things like civil or human rights violations. When a community assessment is needed or a program assessment, when you need to document the process of or gather data for an evaluation of an intervention or program, and when you need to document a site or event or a way of life that is threatened or about to disappear. In my particular study, I actually think a couple of these apply. So when change is necessary, when a situation needs to be publicized, and actually, I didn't plan this, but I ended up documenting displacement in a location that while I was doing the research, the people moved out of that location. So I actually have this record of the final moments of living in this particular place. So Photovoice is identified as a participatory action research method. In the SAGE Handbook of Participatory Research and Inquiry, the authors make a distinction between participatory research and action-oriented research. Participatory research includes processes where evidence is gathered and analyzed in a participatory way. It may or may not integrate action into the knowledge generation process, as action research and participatory action research do. Photovoice very deliberately involves participants in data collection and analysis, but also using that data for action. So you could use Photovoice just to collect data and understand a problem, but generally those who are selecting this method, it's because they want to create some kind of social change when they go to show those photos later on. I'm gonna save us some time. skip over that one. So for the rest of the workshop, what I'm going to do is show how I used a variation of Photovoice for my research project to create a traveling Photovoice exhibition that's showing here on campus. In what follows, I'll briefly recap a little bit about my research problem, question, and theoretical framework, and then I'll go into more detail into the actual implementation of that project, and we'll take some moments to talk about analysis and talk about the general approach to Photovoice. So if you attended my talk last night, then you may have heard that I started by talking about kind of the research problem at the center of my project, which is kind of establishing the issue of displacement both at the global scale, but also at the local scale. So the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees reports 180.4 million forcibly displaced people worldwide due to armed conflict, ecological disaster, etc. Of these, 62.5 million are considered internally displaced people. So the difference between a refugee and an IDP is that IDPs are forced from their home, but they never cross an international boundary. So they're displaced in their home country. In the Republic of Georgia, there are 308,000 internally displaced people out of a population of just 3.7 million. This comes to roughly about 10% of the entire population of the country being displaced. This population can largely be separated into two major groups. So there are two waves of displacement. The first wave of displacement occurred in the early 1990s. After the Soviet Union collapsed, there was basically civil war in Georgia that produced mass displacement. In 2008, Russia invaded Georgia. They had a short 8-day war, essentially 1-week war, that also produced a second wave of displaced people. In my research, I'm primarily focusing on that first wave of displaced people who have now been displaced for basically 30 years. The diverse struggles of IDPs in Georgia have been well documented in the scholarly literature. In particular, the issue of durable housing makes up an important dimension of this research. So for context, a lot of this literature focuses on about 40% of what we call old caseload IDPs from Georgia who ended up in what are called collective centers. Collective centers consist of hotels, schools, industrial complexes, hospitals, boarding facilities, things that were not intended for kind of everyday living were transformed into shelters for IDPs. What's really interesting about these sites is that they were supposed to be temporary and they have essentially become permanent residences. So people have been living in a lot of these collective centers for now 3 decades. A lot of attention has been given to the marginalization and social exclusion caused by the failure to integrate these collectively settled Georgian IDPs into mainstream society. So the places that they're settled are usually spatially as well as socially separated from the rest of kind of urban centers in Georgia. So a feminist curiosity in the precarious material conditions of these collective centers after 30 years really prompted me and my research team to ask, how do housing infrastructure conditions impact IDP's sense of identity, dignity, personhood, agency, and sense of futurity? Now, this question came from an extensive literature review that is informed by what we call the emotional and affective turn in political ecology. And this is heavily influenced by feminist approaches to political ecology. This is an area of research seeking to better recognize the often undervalued political work of emotions and the gendered, intimate, and power-laden embodiments of environmental and social justice conflict. So when we came to this problem, we were really thinking about it in kind of an environmental justice kind of way, looking at the ecology of displacement. This framework helped us kind of theorize that if we were attentive to felt geographies, we could better measure what the literature calls infrastructural violence, specifically how marginalization of internally displaced people becomes operationalized through urban environmental factors, such as disconnections and absences in things like water, sanitation, heating. And even we specifically were really interested in the processes of decay, since the buildings that people were staying in these collective centers had never undergone any type of maintenance or repair in 30 years. So to empirically study emotional dimensions of violent infrastructure, we undertook what we called a feminist visual ethnography. So we use the term feminist visual ethnography as kind of an umbrella term to describe a set of different research methods that we used in our study. The term feminist here refers to how post-structuralist philosophical perspectives based on the cultural turn in political geography inform our attentiveness to things like materiality, emotions, and embodiments of geopolitical violence. So therefore, feminist ethnography, which itself is kind of diverse in the literature, to look up that term, refers to our fieldwork practices and how we come to study lived experiences of infrastructure in flexible, responsive, iterative, and most importantly, caring and trauma-informed ways. That not only strives to understand power differentials, but also to do this in a way that has kind of an emancipatory goal to it. This brings us to the visual part. Visual ethnography involves the use of photography, moving issues, and other types of ways of capturing and expressing the perceptions and social realities of people. This involves using cameras and other technology as a way of recording data, studying visual data itself, and communicating with images and media as a type of dissemination. So what does all this look like in practice, right? That's a lot of jargony stuff. So how did we do this? So we had archival data, so we read a lot of reports and looked at media and that kind of discourse analysis. We did participant observation in the field. So my team and I, we lived in Skulltuna. We hung out with the locals on a daily basis. We spent a lot of time in all their 22 sanatoriums. I'll mention those in a little bit. So we spent a lot of time there. We used documentary photography and videography. So like just hundreds of our own photos and videos of things. Actually a lot of multi-sensory data, because there's a lot of interesting sounds and smells and feelings that are related to the place that we were studying. So we wanted to capture all of that. We had semi-structured walking interviews, because as a geographer, when you're studying space, you don't want to just sit in a room like this and do an interview. You want to see the places that people are talking about. You want them to show you the things and the materials and have that kind of multi-sensory experience. And then finally, we used Photovoice. So I'm going to focus on kind of the use of just the Photovoice component. So in our study, we focused on one field site, which is the city of Skulltuna. This city is located in Western Georgia, the Republic of Georgia. During the Soviet era, Skulltuna was home to 22 sanatoria, which attracted thousands of Soviet workers under the 1936 Constitution, which guaranteed citizens to the right to rest and leisure. After the Soviet Union collapsed, these sanatoriums, which are basically spas, were no longer operational. So when the wars broke out, they saw these buildings, which are giant complexes with essentially hotel rooms, and they thought, well, this is a great place to resettle some of these displaced people. So there, an estimated 10 to 11,000 IDPs were originally resettled here. That is not the current population of Skulltuna. Lots of them have left and are kind of transitory in other places. So these IDPs believed that this arrangement was temporary, but they ended up living in Skulltuna for 30 years. And they were, most of them, there are still some IDPs in some of the buildings. You can actually see them here on the map. They're the bigger structures from the satellite image. Some IDPs still live in a handful of buildings, but most of them have been resettled into a set of new apartment complexes just in the last year. We picked this field site because it had this unique architectural Soviet history, which makes it a really interesting place to study. But more importantly, at the time when we kind of were planning this project, there was an announcement of the privatization of these buildings. And so the reason why these IDPs have been resettled into new homes was because the state wanted to privatize those assets and sell them to private investors. So we were really concerned that IDPs, their interests were being compromised in favor of state political and economic priorities. And here's what some of them look like right here. There's kind of two main architectural styles to these buildings. These ones that have kind of Grecian columns, those are kind of neoclassical. They tended to be built prior to 1970. They invited German architects to come and design these. And then the other ones are more Soviet brutalist, modern, a lot of concrete, a lot of square. And these are typically built from like the 60s through the 80s. So our visual ethnography took place in Sculptuba over the summer of 2021 and the fall of 2021, and then the following year in 2022 in the summer. In 2021, we focused on understanding the lived experience of the people living in these sanatoria. However, as I mentioned, while we were doing this research, the local elections came, the government said, hey, we're gonna give you all new apartments. So we were like there when this was happening. And as a result, people were talking about this. So we thought, hey, why don't we apply for another grant and just come back? And then we can compare their experience from when they lived in these sanatoriums and then what it would look like when they're in their new apartment. So that's exactly what we did. Although we interviewed many IDPs and various types of stakeholders, we only had 10 participants in our actual Photovoice study. These participants were recruited from several different sanatoria using snowball sampling. Although we aimed for gender parity, only 2 out of the 10 participants identified as male. Participants' ages varied from kind of the late 20s, early 30s, all the way to the 70s. And because Photovoice is really labor and time intensive, and engages these hard to reach, often vulnerable populations. If you look in the literature, sample sizes tend to only range between 5 and 15 participants. So with 10 participants, we're kind of, right there in the middle. There are studies that do enroll much larger numbers, but when you're a single researcher with a small team, this alone is a pretty sizable challenge. So each of these 10 Photovoice participants completed the following procedures. This included 4 total, well, in some cases 5, because since we've kind of done some follow-up, so we've talked to some people 5 times. But generally they followed these procedures. So this included, first, we did a preliminary interview. And at the end of the interview, we would invite them to participate in Photovoice. So some people would only do the first interview with us and say, no, that's okay. I don't want to do anything else. And then sometimes people would say, yeah, that photo thing sounds kind of interesting. So if they said yes, we had our bag of cameras. We'd whip out the camera. We would do a quick training with them. And then we would give them their assignment and we would schedule our next meeting with them. So then they would take photos. Most people completed this between 3 to 7 days. After this, we would do what we called a photo dialogue. This was our term for this step where we would meet with them and go over their photos that they took, another kind of interview. Then stage 4 would be what we call like social action. In our case, this was when we planned the exhibition of the photos. And then what I'm not going to talk about today is the 5th step when we came back a year later and we interviewed them again in the new apartments. I will say in my proposal, it says that I would use Photovoice in this second round because I wanted them to take pictures of their new homes, but no one wanted to do this. They just, I'm not sure what the reasons were, but we gave it a try, several interviews, and like no one really was interested in doing it. So we said, we'll just do regular follow-up interviews and, just kind of reconsider that part. So a little bit about the interviewing process. So all interviews were conducted in Georgian with consecutive interpreting to English. Interviews were audio recorded with permission and transcribed. There was only, I think, one person that declined to be recorded. All consent forms and releases were translated into Georgian. Joint collaborative ethnographic field notes. I don't know if that's a thing, but we did it every night where we had a Google Doc and our whole team would sit down and we'd write notes together. That in and of itself is a really awesome exercise. And then we had all of this other type of data that we were collecting through our observations. So stage one, preliminary interview and photo training. So after completing the informed consent procedures in compliance with our IRB protocol, research subjects would complete a preliminary walking interview with us. Following this interview, if they agreed, we would then do a basic photography training with them. During this first interview, participants provided a kind of personal oral history and described their perceptions, experiences, and relationship to changes in the sanatoria infrastructure and conditions over time. So we started out by asking them, how did you come to live here? If they wanted to talk about how they were displaced during the war, and this was kind of our trauma-informed approach, we gave them the space to share that story, but we didn't ask them to. We didn't ask them for it. So some people, you could tell that they had never told that story and they needed to recount those days when the war started and when they fled their home. And other people started from, we stepped off the train or the plane or the car and we were in Skulltuba, and they just totally circumvented talking about the war. And that was fine for us because our concern wasn't the war. That's not what we were studying, but we understood that some of these people maybe needed an opportunity to tell those stories. So following these interviews, we would then do a photography training. So I will talk a lot about my project, what we did, and then what the Photovoice kind of literature tells me to do. So in an ideal context, we had planned to hold a kind of full 2+ hour, maybe half-day workshop on photography for all of our participants. So this would cover how to operate a camera, photography basics, ethics of photography, including using release forms if subjects are involved in their pictures. Because of the pandemic, so you'll note that this part of my study was done in 2021. So these were the cameras that I used. I bought little cases. The cases came, we refilled the batteries with the memory cards. And then we labeled all the memory cards we coded our participants. So then each participant had a separate memory card. So we didn't try to like share memory cards or transfer. That way we had duplications of all the photos. We had it on the memory card, we had it on the external hard drive, we had it in the cloud so that, stuff can happen. We have copies of the photos all over the place. And then what we would do is when we would loan out the camera, we'd swap out the memory card, give fresh batteries, and then reassign. And all the cameras were numbered with like a label system so that we could keep track of them. And you can see this is actually what our equipment bag looked like. So we had the cameras and the cases. This is our filing system for our memory cards, our extra batteries, and we put everything in this camera bag that had spaces for all the cameras, and then recording equipment that went with it. This is a complete inventory list of all the stuff that we had. So I think when we paused there, I was talking about kind of the group discussion component, and that, like for me, I met with the people individually, but normally there would be a group discussion piece. I'm actually thinking of going back and doing this, even though it's been some time has passed, next spring, and actually doing an exhibition for my participants so they can see each other's photos. They don't know each other, they've never met each other, which is unusual for Photovoice. Usually this group of people kind of will become acquainted. So this step I call the photo dialogue. That would normally be the discussion. This is just a copy of kind of the forms that I created. This is, I know that it's small, so details are not as important, but So this is the informed consent photography release we had from the participants. So this was the release form that they signed to me saying that I could use their photos that they took. We had another release form though for them. So if they took a picture where someone's likeness is identifiable, they needed to have a release form from that person giving them permission. Otherwise, we said, you can give us a picture, but we can't use it in any kind of public way. And we actually discouraged folks and said, if you can't get the permission, then just don't do it, right? And that was part of our talk about ethics. We said, you know, how do we take safe photos? How do we take ethical photos? That includes approaching people if you want them to be the subject of your pictures. So our dialogue interview was based on one of two kind of techniques that I've seen in the literature. So the first and most common one that you might read about is in Wong and Burris's literature. It's called the showed technique. So SHOWED. And basically when you're asking people to talk about your photos, they would describe what they see here, what is really happening here, how does this relate to our lives, why does this problem exist, how can we be empowered by this, what can we do about it. I actually used a different approach, which was called the photo technique. It's pretty similar, but it was like, describe your photo, what is happening in the picture, why did you take this picture, what does this picture tell us? And I modified those questions slightly to be a better measure of the things that I was looking at. So we had a question about emotions. And this was really hard for people to talk about. Like they really didn't have words to describe their emotional experience. And in hindsight, and my team and I, we spent a lot of time discussing this, we would in the future actually bring what psychologists use, which is an emotional wheel, where it has clustering of different related emotions and the words for those emotions, because we would ask them, well, what is this memory, how does this make you feel? And they just couldn't figure out how to label that. Happy, sad, whatever. So we thought, you know, would it be helpful if we had a tool where they could look and say, oh yes, what I was feeling was disappointed, right? That's that kind of language. So we did recognize that this was a little bit of a limitation, this question. So I thought what we could do is very quickly, just for like 5 minutes, practice a version of this, like a very tiny one. So I'd ask those of you who have smartphones to flip to your pictures and find us a recent picture. I think in my instruction I said, what are the last 10 you took? Doesn't have to be that, but don't spend a lot of time looking. And then what I'd like you to do is turn to a partner or partner, and I would like you to answer these questions. So what is happening in your photo? And why is this photo important to you? And the hardest question in my research study was, what would you name this photo, right? So I'll just give you a couple of minutes to do this and get through, at least have one person do it and then try to swap. But I can't promise we'll have time to do both people. All right, let's read that together. So I'm not going to ask anyone to share their examples just because I think it's a difficulty in doing that. But what did we learn from this activity?
It's highly individualized.
Yeah, it's very individualized. Are these questions, how were they in answering them? Just to give you some empathy, right? So the idea here is you are becoming empathetic with a research participant. These are the types of questions we would ask them. Did you need prompting from your partner?
I didn't have a photograph because I left my camera home.
And I guess you could borrow a photograph because these questions wouldn't make any
So I had
sense.
to use 1,000 words.
It's a really nice icebreaker.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I would say by the time because we had done a prior interview, like people were really warmed up to us. So we really naturally went into this, and you can spend an awfully lot of time, like 5 pictures. Like, I think there were some people we were with them like 3 hours, 4 hours. I mean, they could talk about one photo for like 40 minutes, essentially. So there's a lot that can happen in doing this. What about the naming part?
That was hard.
I'm telling you from my experience, that was the hardest part of the interview. Because that's also a process of abstraction, right? That's something we as academics do pretty easily, I think. But for our participants, you're basically saying, well, what is this representing in like a phrase or a word? In my experience from my participants, some of them who were very more artistically inclined, like they understood that they were taking photos that were symbolic of stuff, they came in and just a title rolled off their tongue, like they had been thinking about it. And then other folks were just like, I don't know. So as an interviewer, we had to become really skilled because we didn't want to give them the titles. We didn't want to take away that ownership. But sometimes we had to use very careful probing. Like we would say, oh, we would use reflective listening. We would be like, well, we heard you say this about the photo. Is there anything in this description that might be useful that you could use as a title? So in our handwritten notes, we would often, like if they're having trouble, we would circle back to things maybe they repeated. So that kind of on-hand discourse analysis would be like, we heard them say the word like despair like 6 times, right? So we're like, maybe this photo represents that. And so we would kind of help them remember the things that they said as like a way of naming the photograph. So for the sake of time, because I think I've overplanned here, I'm gonna keep moving on. So what I would ask you here, and we'll kind of skip over this, because I know a lot of folks here are seasoned researchers, is you want to think about when you're doing interviews like this, or you're facilitating like a discussion, what makes an effective interview? And some of this is basics, open-ended questions versus closed-ended questions. How do you probe? Using empathetic, reflective listening as a tool for clarifying information. In our case, that was the way we got a lot of our titles. Our body language. Watching also their body language. So I would argue that their narratives are not your only source of information. So in my study, I'm studying emotions. So we were paying a lot of attention, not just what they were saying, how they were saying, were they getting choked up when they described whatever scene? Did they get energetic, excited? Did they brighten? Those observational techniques are included in interviewing. So this moves us to the discussion of data analysis. So group discussions, or the type of individual interviews that I did, are not only a form of data collection, they can also serve as a type of participant-led analysis. So there's 2 ways of thinking about data analysis in this type of project. You can be very top-down as a scholar. You can collect their narratives and you can go back to your, in vivo or whatever, your old school coding, right? And you can come up with a set of categories that represent themes and patterns. Or when your participants are doing their discussion, you can take seriously their way of organizing and making sense of that data and reporting how they interpret these photos and what they mean. So I would say these are not mutually exclusive, right? But you can emphasize or de-emphasize these depending on the type of approach that you're using. If you're really kind of embracing the participatory spirit of this method, I would argue that group co-generation of knowledge is super important. And that's something in my project that I often really miss because we didn't have the opportunity to do that. So I don't know what my participants would say about their photos together. So that's a gap for me. So I'm not going to extensively talk about my findings since this was covered in my talk last night, But I will give you just a summary of what we learned from both looking at the photos and analyzing them, but in particular, we didn't do so much photo analysis ourselves. We analyzed what our participants told us about their photos. I have seen in the literature though, some people actually analyze the photos separately on their own, and then they look at the kind of stories and narrative. We mostly focused on the latter. So in completing the photo dialogue, we kind of came to the following conclusions. So some photos were difficult to categorize, but generally we could organize them into the following major themes. So photos either centered on kind of this cluster of related words: dehumanization, humiliation, shame, or embarrassment. Second, fear, worry, or anxiety. So these were typically places that represented danger in the sanatoriums: danger to self, danger to family or friends, loved ones. And then we kind of had this was like a broad sweeping category for all the photos that we were like, what's going on with these, right? Because they're not about fear and they're not about feeling humiliated. What are they? So we came up with the words escapism, nostalgia, and longing. And this tended to be a category of photos that represented places of mental escape for our participants. So that's why we put the word escapism first. So sometimes these were places like photos of a park bench, and the participant told us, I go to this park bench to remember a place I like to go in Abkhazia. So they would go there and they would do kind of fantasizing and daydreaming. So we call that longing. Like that's a type of nostalgia, but it was tied to the loss of place and kind of fantasizing about return. We saw that in older participants. Younger participants, we saw a different type of nostalgia that was typically places related to like fantastical childhood memories, fun, communal activity, and a lot of optimism. We tended to see much more optimistic and jovial photos in our younger participants because they grew up in the sanatorium as kids, and I don't think they were fully processing the kind of struggles that their families were going through. So they took pictures of things like the rooftop where they would ride their bike around, or the building is where they took dance lessons, those types of things. These terms that we used here are based on participants' use of what we call emotive language in their stories and their descriptions. And these were extrapolated through our attention to their language and their body language as it related to things like sensation words, mood words, disposition words. So this is generally what we saw in the photos. So if you go check out the collection, now you have at least the kind of framework that we were using to make sense of the patterns that we saw between these photos. So one important distinction regarding data analysis that I think is really important to emphasize in any training is the difference between audience and researcher perception and interpretation of a photo and the message that's intended by the photographer themselves. And I think we should, as scholars, should be especially attentive to this so that we are not, when we're reporting our findings, our biases and assumptions are not kind of steering the presentation of that information. We should be careful of how we balance what we see in the photo and what the person is telling us is in that photo. So I thought what we could do, and I know some folks already know the story behind this picture. I've done this before, usually when they haven't seen the collection first, so bear with me. So what I would like just as a group, and I'll take a couple of volunteers, but I'd like you to consider what you see in this photo. So this is kind of standard photo analysis. Tell me just like, what is happening here? What do you see? And then you can give a guess what you think the story is here. What are they trying to tell us? And then I'm always curious in this last question, how does this make you feel seeing it? What is your, so the last activity I asked you to talk about, well, you know, your attachments to the photo. Now I'm asking you as an audience member, how does being an audience member, how does this make you feel? So I'll move the text away so you can just look at the photo. Anyone wanna take a stab at these questions? So what do we see? Just description. What's in this photo?
Bathtub.
Okay, what type of room is it?
Bathroom.
It's a bathroom. It has a bathtub. What else do we see?
It looks like they've adapted parts of the space,
Okay,
but they've added to it.
they've added to it. So what items have been added?
Water tank.
Okay, so there's a tank up here and there's a, I can tell you what it is, but I'm curious if
It's
you
an
know what it
electric
is.
shower, right? It's an electric shower or?
This is how they are heating
Yeah.
Okay.
a hot water heater.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. We've got some Lubas, right? You can't see, it's kind of cut off, but there are some buckets, some shampoo, some other stuff, a mirror. So what do you think the story is here? Why are they taking this picture of the bathroom?
It's a place you go to or not every, go every day.
Yeah. So
Place
it
of privacy.
has something to do with privacy. Yeah.
Oh, you've asked them to take pictures of where they live, right? So
Mhm.
that's probably where someone's bathroom.
Yeah.
We didn't know this, or didn't talk about infiltration, concrete pathologies, mold.
Mhm. How does this make you, this might be an easier question. How does this make you feel?
It's a nice picture. You know what I mean? There's like artistry in the way it's been composed. But I think I know where you're getting at. I think you're expecting us to be like, well, it's really decrepit, the facilities are not very good quality. But then,
Of course you can say that. I'm trying not to expect you, but I am curious, like, you look at this photo, you have a response to it. What is that response?
I wouldn't want to be naked in that space.
Okay.
I'm just curious, you know, I'm just curious of why the person took the picture.
Okay. Curiosity is a fine reaction. That is this is an open-ended question. But when we go to a museum where we look at a photo, we feel we have a response to it. So I'm curious about just what your responses are, not that one is right or wrong.
I mean, I'm wondering if this is maybe, I think someone had said privacy, which made me wonder, is this a place where somebody might go to get some of that escapism?
Okay.
I can close the door, I'm kind of away.
All right, so I'll tell you a little bit about this photo. And there's a reason why I wanted to do this. So it's that a lot of times we encounter, if you want to call this art, right? And we maybe don't have the context or the story, right? So that it's left up to our imagination. We project what we think we're seeing. And we have a response to it. So I love this comment. It's not a place I would want to be naked in, right? Like I look at this and I feel a bit uncomfortable, right? I don't necessarily know why I feel uncomfortable, but I can see this mold and rot up on the ceiling. And I can say I'm very forthcoming with this. I grew up in a low income household, so this triggers me in some uncomfortable ways related to the way that the material circumstances of my own upbringing. But that's from my own personal perspective, right? So everybody's going to see it differently. So what does this photo actually show? So this was taken by our participant, Valeria, and she named it Great Shame. This is a blue tile bathroom. The metal tank in the top corner, she describes this as a creative solution for holding and heating water, especially when one of the things she talked a lot about was how for many years, they often didn't have water in the sanatorium. So they would have to get jugs of water and carry it. They would put it in the tank. So at least they could take some type of shower. And these were the modifications that they made to the bathroom to make it workable over time. So adding a hot water heater, for instance, was one of those things. This woman was deeply uneasy about sharing this photo. In fact, she wasn't going to pick it. She showed us all of our pictures and she hovered on this photo. And she was like, well, I don't want anyone to see this photo. And I like to talk about this one for that reason, because one of the things in our process is that our participants are anonymous. This is confidential. And we remind them that the purpose is, hey, we want to teach people about the uncomfortable things that you're experiencing, because otherwise, this is something very private that people don't talk about. So how does someone know that this is a source of your humiliation and embarrassment if we don't show them this picture, right? So we had this kind of dialogue with her. And in the end, she was like, oh, well, I'm uncomfortable every day. I guess it's okay if someone is uncomfortable for a minute looking at this photo. So she talked about how this bathroom, her whole story like kind of centered around shame and embarrassment. She had several stories, but with this bathroom in particular, she said she had a relative who wanted to come visit from Sochi. And she was so embarrassed that this person might have to use this bathroom. This is a family member. She lied to her family member so that she didn't have to invite her over to see this space. I like this activity for a couple of reasons, because we've done this in classrooms and other workshops, but when we did this in Georgia, with Georgians in the room, they didn't just describe the photo as they were instructed. They read into the photo and they said things like, oh, this is someone who doesn't care about where they live. This is someone who is lazy. And in that moment, my team and I were like, if our research participant heard this, they would be horrified, because it's basically all the stereotypes that they are worried that people believe about them as IDPs. So I like this photo and this discussion to emphasize that what your audience reads and what your participants say the photo is about can contrast differently. And this is one of the risks that we run when we make this art and make it public, right? So having a workshop and a talk, providing the context, I think is essential if we're using this as a tool for social change. In a way that maybe other types of presentations, it would be okay to just allow people to freely and openly interpret them.
Did anyone say anything about the ingenuity and resilience in that picture?
That's interesting. So I did this workshop again that included a bunch of Georgians, but they were all scholars this time. And that was the type of things that they said. They were like, oh, this person's really creative. And I was like, oh, isn't this interesting, the difference in these audiences and like what they're seeing in these pictures. So I did it with American students and they had no context. So they talked a lot about how the setting just kind of made them feel kind of icky and uncertain, and they didn't have a lot of reading about what was being, like, kind of the context, so they didn't have that kind of interpretation. But I've seen various responses to this photo in this activity. So I hope it provides an illustration of just kind of analysis in a general sense. So now I want to talk a little bit about, for the last couple of minutes, the social action component of Photovoice, which is exhibition planning. So group discussions and dialogues can also be used to discuss exhibition planning. Ideally, the whole group of participants should decide how they want to share their pictures and stories with others in the community and who they want as the intended audience for those photos. To complete this step in my project, again, we could not gather people, so we had to ask them individually, and like scholars, we took all their responses, we synthesized them, and then we kind of came up with a plan that we felt was in the spirit of actualizing their suggestions to us. So again, not as participatory as I had imagined or wanted in the original design, but at the same time, and I'm gonna just briefly mention this, my folks really struggled when we asked them, who do you want as their audience? They were like, I don't know, anybody. Parliament. They could name specific cities they thought we could show in, but not venues or particular audiences. They really had no clear vision for what these photos could do. So I would argue that that group discussion is probably a lot more helpful in imagining, like, do we want to have postcards and have some kind of campaign or a pop-up exhibition? This is hypothesizing, but I think in a group, you would have a much easier time of generating and brainstorming ideas. So what ended up happening is we did this kind of like survey where we came up with a list of ways that we could possibly show the pictures, and we would go through them. Do you feel comfortable if we publish this in a book? Do you feel comfortable if we do this? Tell me where you would like us to show. Are you open to us presenting it at conferences, to students, to this types of audiences? And basically we just got their consent for all of these things, because when we left it open-ended, we just were not, they didn't really know what to tell us. So I would say this is like was a really great challenge for us. So all the things that you see me doing with the photos is like, we took what they agreed to and said that they were open to, and we're just kind of showing the pictures as much as possible and anywhere who will show them. And we stay in touch with them, and we let them know what we're doing with the photos. And they generally seem pretty excited that we're just sharing them widely to lots of different audiences. So this brings us to the discussion of exhibition, which is generally just a public display of photographs. And there's a lot of different forms that this could take. And I would encourage you again, just to look at different models when you're working with your communities to determine, do you want to do a gallery exhibition? Do you want to do an online presentation, a website, some kind of pop-up display? These are the types of things that you can provide options and talk about how you want to use those photos with those groups. And I definitely recommend, if you can, work with other types of community partners, exhibition coordinators, local artists, have them come in and talk about different options for exhibition with your participants to give them inspiration or to help them implement these plans. This is one thing I've had to do. Thankfully for people like Scott at the library and other exhibitions coordinators, I didn't know anything about exhibition before I did this project. And I really have been leaning on those partners to help walk me through, well, how do I properly pack my photos to ship them? What kind of material do I print them on? How do we mount them? Like all of those types of procedural questions have been answered by folks who are artists or have more experience than I do. So in my project, our exhibition has taken a number of different forms. So we started out with these, we called them pop-up exhibitions. We actually printed like a fabric banner. We bought like a banner stand. We only put like 6 photos on the banner, and it was more of like a promotional thing to say like, hey, we're doing this project. We had a QR code on it, and we would set it up. We set it up in 2 parks in Georgia, places that our participants told us they wanted us to show. So we went to Tbilisi, to Missouri Park, and we went to Batumi, which is on the Black Sea on the boulevard. And we set up for several nights. We had a third in here, but as context is really important, our work could be viewed as critical of government policy. And as such, the government said, no, you cannot show that banner. They didn't say it in that many words. They said, there are no available dates in July. None. And we said, well, can we suggest another day? They're like, there are no available dates. Never. There are none for you. When we said in Tbilisi, it was when far-right protesters were going through the city. So we were asked to show our permit numerous times by you can interpret who it was, some kind of security service. And people didn't want to stop and look at our banner. Actually, in both cases, we had more Russians and Ukrainian refugees come and talk to us about the banner than we did Georgians, because people were uncomfortable. So in Georgia, it's way easier to come talk to you all who are not stakeholders in this conflict, in this situation. So be aware, whatever you might be working on might be dangerous. I know we're out of time, so if you just spare me 2 minutes, I'll run through the end. So I also have done some other things. So my first major exhibition was at Moravian University, where I used to work. So you can see the big prints in the hallway in our student union building. We also did, and this was a one-time production, but I collaborated with our theater department to create an immersive multimedia installation that had 6 large screens. We built sets. We used artifacts that we collected or printed. We had student voice actors and faculty voice actors. This was separate from the photos. We wanted to tell the material history of infrastructure of the sanatoriums themselves. So we recreated about 100 years of history. You would walk into our black box theater, which we had sections separated by these kind of black curtains. So you would walk through and we'd have a big screen and we had archival footage showing, you know, like Stalin and old like advertisements of the sanatoriums during the Soviet period. Then we would go around the corner and we had a screen playing old archival footage of the news when the Soviet Union collapsed and the war broke out. And then when you went around the corner, we had students who were involved in theater on campus reading excerpts from transcripts from IDPs describing their experience living. And then we recreated like a scene that you would typically see. So like a table like you would see in one of the rooms, a supra table. We created this multimedia board. I had taken hundreds of pictures of wallpaper, which is one of the ways that IDPs help to make their spaces feel more like home. So I took hundreds of pictures of wallpaper. So we created this video that just cycled through all the different patterns of wallpaper over time. They would go around the corner and we built a set of balconies out of collected scrap metal and all sorts of stuff so that it could feel like you were walking through the sanatorium. And then on the screens, we were playing video footage of what it's like to walk through these spaces of dripping water, of dripping sewage, to give you that multi-sensory effect. So we did this with our theater department. It was really, really cool. And we have 2 sets of prints. So we have the large prints. I also have a second set of smaller prints that I use for going to small pop-up types of events like conferences like this here. We have a couple upcoming events this year, and we're always, so if you have colleagues who might be interested in this at other universities, we're looking to show. So send them my way. I've got an online forum. That's how I got connected to Max. And I'd be happy to talk to them about bringing this show to their campus. I've talked a lot about the challenges already. And if you want to stay behind, I'd be happy to talk about how we mitigated risk. But that brings us more or less to the end. I know I want to be cognizant of time. So if you have questions, I'm happy to hang back and answer them, but I know you guys are busy on campus. So I hope this was maybe not the best model of how to do Photovoice, but a model to help you see some of the challenges and ways that we overcame them in our research. So thank you for playing an important role in Photovoice. And if you want to see, before you leave,